Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining me tonight. This is Caroline with Fiveable, and tonight we are going to be investigating the elements of life. So, still staying true to our Chemistry of Life Unit 1. Let me pull up our slides really quick, and those are shared for you also in the chat. When my computer decides to switch these over. There we go. So hopefully you've been tuning in and know a little bit about what we're doing this year. If you're not quite positive, the AP exam has switched a little bit, or AP has switched a little bit from years past. Thankfully, that's not something that you guys really need to worry about because years past, you're just taking it this year. But still, it's important to know that we're going to be working through units in order as College Board has lined up for your teachers. So hopefully this is a unit that you are working on, have worked on, or will work on soon. Last night we started off with Kari, and she talked about hydrogen bonding and water molecules and how important water is. And tonight we'll jump into elements of life. If I had to guess, this probably will be closer to 30 or 40 minutes as opposed to an hour, just because the things that are covered in this particular section are not super in-depth. The Chemistry of Life unit in and of itself is relatively short, but it's a super important one, but it will get slightly more complicated. So if you stay tuned, coming soon, so this is the rest of Unit 1 and the things that we'll be covering. We have Introduction to Biological Macromolecules, Properties, Structure, and Function of Biological Macromolecules, and Nucleic Acids. Those things are going to be more complex than what I'm going into tonight, but you need the foundations that I'm covering tonight in order to have a good understanding of biological macromolecules, their properties, their structure and function, and then specifically about nucleic acids. So just something to keep in mind that it may be a little shorter tonight just because we're introing a lot of these things in order to talk about them more frequently when we get into biological macromolecules, etc. Once we wrap up Unit 1, which should be in the next week or two, then we'll jump into Unit 2, where we'll talk about cells and cell functioning, and continue on with that progression. So if you're interested in seeing what we have coming up after Unit 1, I can post some of those things. But again, we're just going to follow College Board's 8 units. So if you're wondering how we decided to go in this order, hopefully it's an order that your teachers are following as well. Okay, so that's what's coming up next. Just to go back a slide, if you are taking notes at all tonight, which is a great idea, if you've tuned in at all last year to any of my sessions, you know that most of my slides are just picture-based, and I talk a lot. It's great. So what you should have is like a pad of paper or something nearby so that you can be taking notes, just because I will be sharing definitions and things like that as we move throughout. And if you post a picture and tag Fiveable on Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube, you might get a shout out or a prize or something along those lines. Okay, Brandon, don't panic too much. So teachers will go in all sorts of orders. Ecology I usually save for last, but some teachers like to get it over with in the beginning of the year just because the weather's nice and you can go outside. So this is still really helpful because the elements that we're talking about and elements of life obviously exist in ecology as well. And scientific method and graphing is super important. Also, Brandon, just kind of good advice with graphs. You will have to create a graph most likely on one of the long free responses. And same, Hamed, with your stat analysis. Both of those are going to be really, really key, especially in the free responses this year. So those are definitely things to keep in mind, and I'm sure your teachers will continue to use them as the year goes on. So those are still really important things to get a clear understanding of. And the nice thing is that then when you're tuning into these casts, you can get just some background information, and then you'll have a head start for when your classmates talk about this kind of stuff. And some teachers, depending, like they might skip this unit or shorten it just because you may have already had chemistry. You may not have had chemistry. Who knows? My students have not had chemistry before. They kind of take it in conjunction with AP. So Anyway, there's lots and lots of ways that this unit can look, and this will just provide you extra support. So what I'll be covering is just kind of an introduction. We'll talk about elements versus compounds and what that means, different properties of elements, the formation of chemical bonds, and the most common elements of life. So again, it probably isn't going to take a whole hour. If anything, it might take more like 30 or 40 minutes, but that gives us lots of extra time for you guys to ask questions. So if you're confused at any time, for some of you, depending on your chemistry background, this might be like super basic review, and that's great. This will just be like a little refresher in case you've forgotten some things. If you haven't had chemistry before, then this is the really important chemistry that you need to be familiar with going into AP Bio, because there's chemistry, there's math, there's all sorts of things wrapped into AP Biology. It's not as simple as it might seem. Okay, so let's first just start out by talking about the difference between an element and a compound, just because that's vocabulary that your teachers may use and you may use pretty frequently, and it might show up in like a free response or something like that. So elements, on the left-hand side, you see the periodic table of elements. So those are the 92 naturally occurring elements on Earth. And the definition of an element, and this is in your notes. If you see, I'll show you. Whoop. Oh, that's interesting. I've actually never really clicked on the notes here, but I guess that's pretty helpful. But you have these as well, so you don't have to feel like you have to write all these things down. But an element is a substance that cannot be broken down into another substance. So they're pure, naturally occurring, and you can see them here, things like gold, magnesium, fluorine, helium, hydrogen, all sorts of fun things. And again, they exist in their pure form. They cannot be broken down. That's an element. So we'll talk about mainly elements today that form compounds. So if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, you see an absolutely crazy structure. And this is me scaring you away from ever taking organic chemistry. But you'll probably take organic chemistry in college, depending on what you're majoring in. And that lovely structure is a compound, which is when elements are bonded together in a unique pattern. It has to be at least 2 elements in order to be a compound. You can see there that's a lot more than 2 elements, and we can talk about some of the bonding patterns that we're seeing here. Something that I'll point out, just because we're going to talk about it a lot, is that every single junction that you see here that's not labeled, every single intersection is a carbon. And carbon is going to be the most important backbone for all living things. And we'll talk about why there's specific properties of carbon that make it really useful for creating our macromolecules. Okay, so elements versus compounds, just be aware of the difference. Compounds can be broken down, elements cannot. And you can always remember the periodic table of the elements if you get confused about that. Okay, so now specific to the human body, because obviously as biologists, this is what we care about most. You can see a list of elements in the human body. 65% of our body is actually oxygen. Then we have 18.5% carbon, about 10% hydrogen, and then you can see the rest are pretty small. So mainly oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen. So question for the group, all 2 people that are lovely and engaged right now. What can you think of that is a lot of our body that would contain a lot of oxygen and hydrogen? Why do we have so much oxygen and hydrogen? Because they're not just freestanding elements, they're bonded into a compound. Yes, Brandon. Yes, perfect. Water is a huge component of our bodies. Depending on who you ask, it's anywhere between like 65 and 75% of our body. Obviously, we drink it. We use it for a lot of things. Water is super important. That's why we had an entire cast on it last night. If you didn't get to watch it live with Kari, you can definitely watch the replay because there's a lot of important things about water that make it really, really unique, and living things would not exist without it. You do not need to memorize the amount of each element in our body for the AP exam. And Hamed, I'm actually glad that you brought that up because it's a good opportunity for me to say that there are not many things that you need to have memorized for the AP exam. You may have heard that like bio is a whole ton of memorization. And that's not really true anymore since they've redesigned the exam in 2013 and then again this year. It's really application based. So oftentimes they provide you with that kind of high level information, like they may show you a table like this and then just ask you to explain, or they'll use kind of a question like I said, like, oh, water, or if they say, what's a carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen containing compound, you might need to be familiar with that, but you certainly don't need to know the percentages. I'm also glad that you're already asking about the AP exam. Shows that you're super driven, you're ready to rock and roll. But yeah, I'll always say if there's something that needs to be memorized, I'll let you know. Most things you just need to be really familiar with the concepts, but you don't need to spend a whole lot of time. Like when I took the AP exam before 2013, I had like 2,000 flashcards, and that's just not necessary anymore. So hopefully that's good news for you. But the application that they ask you to do is arguably harder. Okay, so just to break this down, carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen are going to be the three most important things that are in the human body. Obviously, they're the three that have the highest percentage, but I'll go into more detail. So we're going to slightly introduce macromolecules. And I can explain why carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen are so very important. But it is important to know that's something that you should remember, that those three things are going to be the foundation of all other things that make up humans and other plants and animals. So the macromolecules, what I was referring to. So macro means large. It's really important to remember these Greek and Latin root words. And as often as I can, I'll bring them to your attention. Macro, large. When we talk about macroevolution, that's large scale evolution. Macroeconomics, that's economics on a large scale versus microeconomics, which would be studying just bits and pieces of how things are changing and moving. Microscope, right, is small, macro, large. Okay, so these are the large molecules. So molecules, compounds, things that are binded together that make up humans, plants, animals, living things. So we have proteins, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and lipids. Okay, so proteins. Can either of you list maybe a food source that would be considered a protein? Love it. Chicken. Perfect. Any other ones? Beef. Love that. Yes. Meats, eggs. Tofu has lots of protein in it. Some beans have protein in it. But protein is going to be probably the most important macromolecule that we talk about. Protein is the doer of the cell, okay? So it's coded for by our nucleic acids, which we'll talk about in a second. But it's the thing that actually gives us our traits, our features, our characteristics, and actually does all of the work for our body. Very, 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 very important. And we'll have tons of time to talk about how proteins are made and coded for and all the different unique things that they do. What you need to know as far as elements of life go is the 4, sometimes 5 elements that make up a protein. So already talked about the big 3, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. They're going to be in all 4 of these macromolecules. Proteins, as a 4th, have nitrogen and sometimes sulfur. There's 2 amino acids that have sulfur in them, gives them a little bit of a special property, but all are going to have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. And that's something that you should be familiar with for the AP exam, because they may give you kind of like a misguided question where they say that nitrogen is present in something, and you need to know that that's potentially a protein, as opposed to one of the other 4. So good thing to know, and we're familiar with proteins. All right, carbohydrates. What's an example of a carbohydrate? Bread. Yes, perfect. Any others? Sugar. Yes. Yes, yes, yes. In fact, sugar is the base of carbohydrates. So I'm glad that you said that. Breads, pastas, and sugars. So a carbohydrate monomer, or one of the small building blocks that makes up a carbohydrate, could be glucose, could be sucrose. If you hear ose at the end of something, OSE, that's your hint that it's a sugar and therefore a carbohydrate. So just something, again, to be familiar with so that you can kind of analyze these structures if they give you something tricky like that. Carbohydrates are simply carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So they don't have the added nitrogen like a protein. They're very, very simple. and that helps define them, and they're mainly going to be used for energy. But I don't want to go into too much detail about carbohydrates just because our intro to macromolecules and things like that, we'll talk about them more in depth. All right, nucleic acids. What are they? Examples of a nucleic acid. Yes, DNA and RNA. Perfect. Okay, so nucleic acids, what do you need to know about them? They also have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. No surprises there, but they also have nitrogen and they have phosphorus. Okay, so yes, chump, exactly. So you're already familiar with this. Good thing to remember for the AP exam, because again, they could give you something where they say, oh, you're a scientist, you stumble upon a macromolecule that possesses phosphorus. And right off the bat, you know that they're talking about a nucleic acid because neither of the other four have phosphorus in them. And you just got that question right because now it's a simple question about DNA or RNA when another student might be struggling because they don't know that phosphorus only presents itself in nucleic acids. Okay, and then lastly, lipids, examples of lipids. Butter and oil. Yes, love it. Lipids are going to be our fats, fatty acids, oils, nuts, butters, all that good stuff. And similarly to carbohydrates, they only have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. But they are constructed in such a way that they are very hydrophobic. Hydro meaning water, phobic meaning fearing. So they are water fearing. And that should make sense if you've ever heard or tried or seen in like a elementary lab or something that oil and water do not mix. Okay, that's because of the polarity differences. So if you tuned in last night, you know that water is polar, and I can talk about that a little bit in a bit, but we have an unequal distribution of charge. So there's slight charges on a water molecule, and lipids are very much nonpolar and therefore kind of repel that polarity and that charge. And that is really, really important. It's something that you've probably known forever. You may have made like a lava lamp or something when you were little, but it's an essential fact to know when we talk about the phospholipid bilayer, which makes up the plasma membrane around our cells. The phospholipid bilayer is going to have a lot of lipids in it, obviously, phospholipid, and that's going to pose a problem for water and other water-loving things. Okay. Any questions? I know this is probably basics, could be review. The good news is if this is easy for you, then you're ahead of the game. And this intro unit is really more designed for students who don't have much of a chemistry background. So you guys are great though. Thank you for participating so much. Okay, so now that we've talked about the elements, we've talked about the elements that make up living things in our body / the macromolecules. Some components to know about elements just to be familiar with. We have, I have carbon as our example, just because that's going to be the most fundamental element. It's going to be the backbone of all things. Some things to know, we have protons and neutrons, and then electrons circling. The amount of electrons that we have determines the property of that element. On the next slide, I'll talk a little bit about electronegativity. An atom desires negative charge or electrons, and that's going to influence a lot of the bonding and the polarity that we talk about in this class. So it's just important to have that foundation and know that the amount of electrons that are circling the nucleus of an atom are going to have a large impact on how it behaves. You should be, familiar with the number of protons that a compound has, its atomic mass. And then this guy right here, carbon, being so essential because it has these 4 valence electrons, which makes it very open to form 4 very stable, very strong covalent bonds, of which I'll start talking about in a second. But that sets it up really, really nicely to form that full octet of electrons. We always want to have 8 electrons in every valence shell, which is what this sphere is called. 2 in the innermost shell, and then 8 in all of the shells to follow. So because we only have 4 here, it makes it very, very easy to form 4 bonds, share 4 electrons with other molecules, often hydrogen, which forms a nice stable compound. Oh my gosh, yes, you're right. The number of protons is the atomic number. So upper right-hand corner, carbon has 6 protons. It also happens to have 6 neutrons, which you can tell because its atomic mass is 12. And only protons and neutrons have weight, 1 atomic unit of weight. So if there's 6 protons, there must be 6 neutrons to add up to 12. Electrons have no mass. But if it's a stable compound, it will also have 6 electrons, which we see in the middle there, 2 on the first orbital and then 4 in the second to even out the charge from the positive protons. Okay, cool. So just some things to know. Again, you're not going to have questions about valence electrons on the AP exam, but you need to be familiar with why molecules bond in the way that they do. And in order to know that, you need to be familiar with the valence electrons that are present. Okay. All right, so electronegativity, as I referred to earlier, is going to be the desire that an atom has for electrons. So what you'll see here is the red and the orange is the strongest desire for electrons, whereas like the lighter you get, the less desire. So you can see fluorine in the upper right-hand corner is the most electronegative atom in the periodic table. But right next to it, oxygen is the second most. Oxygen loves, craves, needs electrons very, very badly. It is electron hungry, and that is super important to know because 1, it leads to the polarity of water, which is so important. And again, whole cast on that last night that you can watch if you're looking for more information. But 2, that's going to come into play when we talk about cellular respiration. So cellular respiration is going to have oxygen's electronegativity at the forefront. And it's part of the reason why we can make a lot of energy from our food for our body. So the electronegativity of oxygen actually comes up quite frequently and also contributes to some of the bonding that we're going to talk about in a second. Any questions about electronegativity? I can go into a little bit more detail if you want, or we can move on. Good? All right, cool. So all of this leads to, oh, thank you, Brandon. Made my night. That's what we're here for, hopefully to help you guys out. And again, I'm glad that it's just a review for you. So this is the stuff that's most important for AP. So it's nice that, because you learn a lot in chemistry, you're not going to remember all of it. This is the stuff that's really important that you're carrying with you throughout this year. So you can kind of weed through all the other things that you learned, because most of it will not transfer over into this class. But these things are very important to remember. Okay, so bonding, the 3 types of bonds that you need to be familiar with: covalent, ionic, and hydrogen bonding. So covalent bonds are going to be the bonds that create molecules. So what are they? It's the sharing of valence electrons between 2 atoms. Okay, so I'm actually going to flip ahead a slide because I want to show you the picture of that. So here's our covalent bond up here. And you can see carbon has those 4 valence electrons that we were talking about. They have the 2 in the inner shell and then the 4 in this outer orbital. Okay, and then hydrogen has 1. So hydrogen is always really looking to form bonds as well, because it just has that inner shell that it needs 2 electrons in. So it has 1. If it can get another, it's a happy camper. So carbon and hydrogen, it's really just a beautiful love story. And you can see that they're forming together so nicely here, and they're sharing their electrons nicely because they both have just a moderate or small electronegativity. No one's greedier than the other person. There's not a huge difference between their electronegativities. So they're sharing nicely, and that forms a really strong bond, a covalent bond. Strength, strong. Elements involved, any two elements bonded via covalent bond form a molecule. Most things can form these as long as they don't have electronegativities that are too different from one another. And we'll talk about that when we talk about ionic bonding in a second. But as long as their electronegativity is relatively close together, they can form these really, really strong bonds that make up all of our molecules. So glucose is an example, but I will also highlight that water is an example as well. And you can see that here. Between the oxygen and hydrogen of a water molecule, we have covalent bonding. Hydrogen bonds we'll talk about in a second, but they're not the ones that actually form the molecule of water. So again, that's equal sharing of electrons. Ionic bonding is going to be when we see that gap in electronegativity become too large. So two oppositely charged atoms unequally share electrons. They almost don't share at all. One just kind of grabs from the other, and those things can be easily broken apart, especially if they're dissolved in a polar charged solution such as water. So the strength here is moderate. It's not super strong. It's not nearly as strong as a covalent bond just because they're not sharing. And the elements involved here would be ions. So ions are going to be anything that's charged. Cations are positive. I'm sure your chemistry teacher did that to you, but positive like a cat, cations. And then anions are negative. I don't really have a cute little rhyme for you to remember that. So if you have a positive and a negative ion paired together, that could be an ionic bond. And an example would be NaCl or salt. So here you can see Na is relatively positive. It actually wants to get rid of this electron. It likes to live as Na+. So if you remember from chemistry, since Na only has one electron in its outer shell, it would rather get rid of that and have a complete octet. And live as a positively charged molecule. Chlorine, on the other hand, is only missing one electron to have a full octet, and so it is very electron hungry as well. So it will steal that electron. Now, chlorine is negatively charged because it gained an electron, and it's happy because it has a full octet. Sodium is positively charged because it lost an electron, and it's happy because it has a full octet. These two are technically still bonded. It's just a weak bond, and if we put sodium chloride in water, it will technically dissociate or break apart into these two compounds. Hamed, I'm not ignoring your question, I promise. I just want to get through bonding, and then I'll jump in to answer your question. So once I talk about hydrogen bonds, we can talk about differences. Okay, so hydrogen bonding is going to be the weakest, and it's actually between molecules, not within molecules, because molecules are going to be formed with either covalent or ionic bonding. So hydrogen bonds are going to be attractions between a hydrogen atom and a very electronegative atom. Specifically, my teacher used to always say hydrogen bonding is fun, meaning F-O-N, because it's not really all that fun. But it happens between fluorine, oxygen, and nitrogen, and hydrogen. So hydrogen and fluorine, hydrogen and oxygen, hydrogen and nitrogen will form these kind of electric attractions because hydrogen is slightly positive, and all of those things carry that kind of slightly negative electronegative charge that's looking for that positivity. So an example of hydrogen bonding that, again, we had a whole cast on last night is the bonding between water molecules. So the relative positive charge on a hydrogen, just because more of the electrons that are shared between hydrogen and oxygen are going to sit near the oxygen molecule, which is very electronegative. So we call this a partial charge. Hydrogen has a partial positive charge. And since oxygen has a slightly or partial negative charge, those two are going to be attracted to each other, and it forms these relatively weak hydrogen bonds. Hydrogen bonds give water all of its properties, like cohesion, sticking together like this, adhesion, sticking to another surface, like when it's climbing up the inside of a tree, surface tension, and having a very high specific heat. It takes a lot of energy for water to warm up. If you think about the ocean in the summer versus the sand in the summer, sand is super hot, water is really not hot at all, and that's because it takes a lot of energy to warm water up, especially something as vast as an ocean or a lake. Hydrogen bonds are also going to be really, really important when we talk about nucleic acids. The nucleotides that bond together in the middle of DNA are easily broken apart because they are hydrogen bonded. That's important because we break those bonds all the time for DNA replication and transcription. Okay, so those bonds need to be easily broken. So therefore the hydrogen bond between them is a good fit because it is a relatively weak bond. Okay, Hamed, back to your question. How big of a difference is AP Bio to Honors Bio? So it's hard for me to answer that because it's really dependent on your school and your teachers. I think the biggest thing that I can say about the difference that I would assume exists in your school is that AP Bio is completely and totally application based. And what I mean by that, and once we start looking at AP level questions, you'll kind of see this. But what I mean by that is you're not just learning information, you're applying it to a new situation. My students always complain. They're like, we didn't learn this. Yes, you did learn it. It's just that now you need to apply it to a new scenario. So not only do you need to be super familiar with what a covalent bond is, but you need to know how that would affect that molecule in a different situation. It's kind of hard to explain with this chemistry unit, but like with cells, you don't need to just be able to tell me what the lysosome does. That's what you might need to do in honors biology, memorize all the organelles and tell me what they do. But in AP biology, I'm going to ask you a question about what happens if the lysosome ruptures. So you need to be familiar with what the lysosome does and then apply it to how is that going to affect the rest of the cell if this thing explodes, right? That's a way harder question, and that's what's going to make AP harder. And then AP has a lot more writing in it, a lot more technical labs, most likely, and a lot more writing, just because half of your exam, 50% of your exam is based on your writing. So I'm assuming your teacher will have you writing all the time in order to practice, because you really need to know your stuff. It's not just going to be multiple choice. You need to be able to explain your thoughts in writing. So those would be the biggest differences that I could imagine that you would need to be familiar with. In order to kind of make the distinction between the two courses. And then obviously with AP, you take an exam at the end, you could get college credit. You have a higher strength of schedule, which is something that colleges look at to see that you've taken advantage of AP classes. So some benefits there. Any other questions? I'm glad you asked. It's important to know. Cool. Okay, so carbon bonding, just to reflect back on that, I just wanted to show you some examples of how carbon can bond. So on the left-hand side in ethane, that is obviously 2 carbons bonded together with 6 hydrogens. You'll notice that carbon is binding 4 times. It has to, it always does. Carbon never carries a charge. It's very neutral. So 1, 2, 3, 4 on that carbon. This carbon has 1, 2, 3, 4. Everything checks out. Other molecules can break the rules. Carbon does not. Okay, so keep that in mind. It is always going to form 4 bonds. I could ask you a question and show you carbon that isn't bonded 4 times, and you would know that something is wrong with that molecule and that it doesn't really exist. Ethene in the middle here, now we have a double bond. Okay, so carbon 1, 2, 3, 4 bonds still. This one 1, 2, 3, 4. We have that double bond, which means that those carbon molecules are sharing 2 electrons as opposed to just 1. This is going to be really important to know when we start talking about lipids. If you've ever heard of saturated versus unsaturated fats, a saturated fat is all of its carbon molecules are saturated with bonds. Okay, so we have only single bonds in a saturated fat. What that means is it packs together, okay, because everything is flat and everything is bonded fully. All of those fatty acids can bond on top of one another, and that can clog our arteries, our vessels, our veins, all of our pathways in our heart because they can stack together very compactly. And unsaturated fat is not fully saturated, meaning there's at least one double bond, okay? So we don't have every carbon saturated with hydrogens around it. And that one double bond is enough to kind of throw a curve in the molecule. And when that happens, those things cannot stack as nicely together, and they're not going to cause as many problems inside of our blood vessels and passageways. So that's why saturated fats are always considered worse than unsaturated because they can clog up because they're fully saturated, not to repeat myself for the millionth time, with hydrogen bonds. So that's something that we'll continue to talk about, but just trying to show you that carbon bonding is going to end up being important because of things like lipids. And that's something that you would need to know, like if you were a doctor, to be able to explain to a patient what the difference is and why they should steer clear of saturated fats. Okay, so then lastly, all the way on the right, we have a triple bond. That's ethyne. So just 3 different kind of iterations of a 2-carbon molecule. And we have that triple bond, so 3 electrons for carbon from the triple bond and 1 from the hydrogen attached means 4 for both of those. Carbon is a happy camper. It has to have all 4 of those bonds present. Okay, again, this will all come into play. Remember that all 4 macromolecules, carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, and nucleic acids have carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen at their foundation, okay? And then we just throw in nitrogen for proteins and then nitrogen and phosphorus for DNA. But these bonds are going to obviously come up a decent amount for things like that. Any questions? Shreya, do you need to know about isomers? That is a great question. And I'm trying to think if I've ever seen isomers on an AP exam. I don't believe that I have. If anything, they would give you the information and just ask you to analyze. But I have never seen you need to know something like that. So I don't want to say no and then have you come back in May and be like, it was on there. But I've never seen it. So, and I've never taught it to my students. So you should be okay without. Great question. Any other questions? Okay, cool. So post your notes if you took any notes tonight. But I do want to remind you that there's lots of stuff coming up. So next week we'll have the introduction to biological macromolecules. I believe that's Monday at 8 p.m. Eastern. Okay. And properties of biological macromolecules will be, I believe, Thursday at 6 p.m. Eastern. But check the calendar. And then the week following, we'll have structure and function of biological macromolecules and nucleic acids. So lots of big, important things coming up. Definitely stay tuned. Ask questions if you have them. That's what we're here for. And remember that this is just like the tip of the iceberg, and we'll be soon jumping into all of the other biological importances that go along with these compounds. Any other questions? We have time if anyone has questions, even if it's not related to what we talked about tonight. Okay, I'll let y'all go then. Enjoy your evening. Definitely tune in next week. Brandon, I'm so glad that you had a great time. I'm really glad that you were here, and thank you for putting in the effort to answer questions and ask questions and do all of those lovely things, because it makes my job that much more exciting to have interactions on the other end. So keep coming back, tell your friends, get your classmates involved, and we'll have a great time this year. So I'm looking forward to it, and we have some other great streamers as well. So thank you, and have a great night, and hopefully we'll see you next week.